Rain in Austin never lasted long, but it always seemed to choose the worst possible mornings to fall. Harper Lane stood behind the counter of Common Grounds, the small cafe tucked into the lobby of the Wolfe Tower, and watched the gray sheets of water streak down the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, umbrellas bloomed like dark flowers across the plaza. Inside, the espresso machine hissed and sighed, filling the air with the smell of roasted beans and warm milk, a smell Harper had come to think of as the smell of safety. She had worked in that lobby for 4 years. She knew the building the way some people knew a favorite song, every groove, every silence, every place it changed key. She knew that the marketing floor ordered oat milk lattes and never tipped. She knew that the legal team drank black coffee like it was medicine. She knew that on Fridays, the junior analysts from the 40th floor would come down in a nervous herd, laughing too loudly, relieved to have survived another week. And she knew better than she wanted to that none of them ever really looked at her. "Morning, Harper." That was Doreen Foss, 71 years old, silver hair cut in a sharp bob. A retired schoolteacher who came in every day at 7:15 for a decaf Americano and the crossword. Doreen was not a tenant of the tower. She lived 2 blocks over and simply preferred Harper's coffee to the diner on her corner. "Filthy morning. Filthy," Harper agreed, sliding the paper cup across the counter. 7-letter word for unexpected joy. Doreen considered it, tapping her pen against her lips. "Try again tomorrow. I like to earn my answers." Harper laughed, and for a moment the gray morning felt a little less gray. That was the rhythm of her life. Small kindnesses passed back and forth over a counter, the only kind of currency she fully trusted anymore. She had learned 3 years ago in a much crueler and more expensive way that the other kind of currency, the kind people spent to get what they wanted from you, could not be trusted at all. She did not think about that morning often. She had trained herself not to. But some rainy days brought it back anyway, the way certain smells bring back a whole house you used to live in. She was still thinking about it faintly, distractedly, when the doors of the tower opened and a man walked in wearing a canvas jacket 2 sizes too big, soaked through at the shoulders, carrying a battered gray toolbox in one hand. He did not belong to any department she recognized. He did not carry a badge on a lanyard the way the tenants did. He stood just inside the door for a moment, water pooling around his worn boots, looking up at the vaulted ceiling and the gold-lettered directory as if he had wandered into a cathedral by accident. Harper watched him check a folded piece of paper, then look toward the freight elevator at the far end of the lobby, then back at the paper, clearly lost. "Building maintenance is through there," she called out, pointing toward the service corridor. "Take her right past the mailroom. There's a sign." He turned, startled that anyone had spoken to him at all, and for a half-second Harper caught the full weight of his eyes, a deep, tired blue, the kind of blue that had seen more than it wanted to say. Then he ducked his head the way people do when they are used to being invisible and haven't decided yet whether being seen is dangerous. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low, a little rough, like a man who hadn't used it much that morning. I'm new. Sorry, first day." "Everybody's first day looks like that," Harper said, nodding at his soaked jacket. "You want a coffee before you head back there on the house. Welcome to the building special." He hesitated. She would remember that hesitation for a long time afterward, the way his eyes flicked to the price board, then to his own pocket, then back to her face, calculating something that had nothing to do with the price of coffee. "I don't want to be any trouble," he said. "It's a cup of coffee," Harper said, "not a mortgage." That got a small surprised laugh out of him, quiet, like it had been rusted shut and only just worked loose. "Alex," he said. "Alex Carter." "Harper," she said, already reaching for a cup. "Welcome to the building, Alex Carter. Fair warning, the elevators on this side are slow, the 4th-floor bathroom door sticks. And if anyone tells you the coffee here is fine, they've never had it anywhere else." He almost smiled at that. Almost. He took the coffee like it was something fragile, thanked her twice, and disappeared down the service corridor with his toolbox banging softly against his knee. Harper did not know, standing there wiping down her counter in the gray Monday light, that the next 6 months of her life had just walked in wearing the wrong-sized jacket. She did not know that the man with the tired blue eyes owned the building she was standing in, owned, in fact, 11 more just like it across 4 states, and a technology company that 11,000 people depended on to make their mortgage payments. She did not know that in a boardroom 60 floors above her head, A group of frightened, furious executives were at that exact moment trying to explain to a horrified investor relations team why their CEO had not been seen in public in 19 days. She only knew that a stranger had looked embarrassed to accept a free cup of coffee, and that something about the particular quality of his loneliness had reached straight through her careful, well-defended heart and pressed gently on an old bruise. If someone walked into your life looking completely ordinary, worn shoes, empty pockets, nothing to offer but a quiet thank you, would you judge them by what they had or by how they made you feel? Harper didn't ask herself that question yet. She would soon enough. Everyone watching this story already knows she will. Because 2 floors above the lobby, in a service stairwell, no tenant ever used. Alex Carter stopped, set down his toolbox, and pressed the heel of his hand against his chest, as if he could physically hold something in. For the first time in longer than he could remember, someone had been kind to him for no reason at all. He intended to keep it that way. He intended for as long as he possibly could to be nobody's boss, nobody's headline, nobody's mistake. He intended to be simply and entirely a man named Alex, in a jacket that didn't fit, learning for the first time in 19 years what it felt like to be liked before he was known. He had no idea yet how expensive that small, selfish wish was going to become, or how much it would cost the woman with the tired eyes and the 7-letter crossword clues once the truth finally came looking for both of them. The Wolfe Tower rose 52 stories above downtown Austin, a spire of glass and steel that caught the morning sun like a struck match. It had been built 12 years earlier by a company called Meridian Systems, back when Meridian Systems was 4 engineers and a server rack in a rented duplex. Now it was one of the largest cloud infrastructure firms in the country, and the tower bearing its co-founder's name was less a building than a monument to ambition, to relentless work, and to a man almost nobody in the lobby had ever actually seen. Harper knew the name Alexander Wolfe the way she knew the names of distant celebrities. He existed in headlines, in framed magazine covers, in the elevator bank, in a company town hall video that played on a loop in the lobby's east wall, a tall, composed man in a charcoal suit talking about human-centered infrastructure to an auditorium of applauding employees. She had watched that video maybe 400 times without ever really looking at his face. He was scenery, furniture, the idea of a person rather than a person. She thought about him exactly as often as she thought about the moon, which is to say she noticed he existed and then she went back to her actual life. Her actual life that week revolved considerably more around the new maintenance hire. He showed up every morning at 6:45, a full 15 minutes before his shift technically started. And every morning he stood at the counter with the faint, apologetic posture of a man who expected to be told to leave. Harper made it a rule within the first 3 days to have his coffee ready before he reached the register. "You don't have to keep doing that," he told her on Thursday, watching her set the cup down. "I don't have to do anything," Harper said. "I like doing it. Different thing." He looked at her for a moment too long, like he was trying to work out if that could possibly be true. Then he nodded, took the coffee, and said quietly, "Thank you, Harper," in a voice that made her name sound like something worth being careful with. She learned things about him the way you learn the shape of a coastline, not all at once, but in a slow accumulation of small visits. He fixed the walk-in cooler's failing compressor on a Tuesday afternoon without being asked, staying 40 minutes past the end of his shift, refusing the $20 bill she tried to press into his hand. "Buy Doreen a coffee sometime instead," he said. "She does the crossword out loud. It's the best part of my morning." "You've been listening to Doreen's crossword. She's loud," he said with the ghost of a smile. "And she's usually wrong about the 7-letter answers." Harper laughed so hard she had to lean on the counter, and something in his face changed when she did, opened briefly like a window cracked to let in air that had been stale for a very long time. He fixed the flickering light above the mailroom. He rehung the crooked directory sign in the east lobby that had bothered Harper for 2 years, and that she had complained about to at least 6 different property managers, none of whom had ever done anything about it. He carried heavy boxes for the elderly janitor, a stooped, quiet man named Walter Higgs, without being asked, and Walter, who did not warm easily to anyone, started saving him the good radio station on the maintenance office's ancient boombox. "You're better at this job than the last 3 guys combined," Walter told him one evening, not looking up from the panel he was rewiring. "Where'd you learn to fix electrical like that?" Alex's hand stilled just slightly over the wires. "Picked it up," he said. "Here and there. It was Harper would later understand the precise truth wearing a very convincing disguise. Alexander Wolfe had in fact built the first server room of Meridian Systems himself in a garage with a soldering iron and a library book on electrical code because there had been no money to pay anyone else to do it. He had picked it up here and there. He simply left out the part where here and there meant founding a multi-billion-dollar company from nothing. What Harper saw across those first 2 weeks was a man who worked twice as hard as anyone asked him to, who never once complained about the low pay or the long hours, who flinched slightly whenever anyone raised a voice near him, and who looked every single day faintly astonished that anyone would offer him something, a coffee, a laugh, a moment of ordinary human warmth without expecting something back. She did not know yet that his astonishment was the truest thing about him, that a man worth billions of dollars had not in 19 years been able to trust a single person who smiled at him not to want something from the balance in his bank account. She only knew that she liked him. Quietly, cautiously, the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. "You're staring," said Priya Anand, Harper's assistant manager, a sharp-eyed 24-year-old business school dropout who ran the register on weekday afternoons and considered herself Harper's unofficial romantic advisor. "At maintenance guy." Again. "I'm not staring, I'm supervising the espresso machine. The espresso machine is 6 feet to your left. You're staring directly at the guy recalking the window seal." Harper flushed and busied herself with a rag she did not need. "He's just nice, that's all. It's rare." "Nice is rare," Priya agreed, wiping down the pastry case. "So is a guy who fixed the milk steamer without being asked and didn't try to explain to you how espresso machines work while he did it. I'm just saying, ask him to get a beer sometime. Life's short, Harper. You've been guarding that heart of yours like it's Fort Knox for 3 years. Harper's smile faltered just slightly, the way it always did when anyone got too close to that particular subject. 3 years ago, she had been engaged to a man named Trevor Boyd, who had, it turned out, been more interested in the modest inheritance from her grandmother's house than in Harper herself, a fact she had discovered 4 days before the wedding in the ugliest possible way when she'd overheard him telling his groomsmen exactly that at his own bachelor dinner. She had not cried in the end. She had simply packed a bag, driven to her sister's house in Round Rock, and spent 6 months relearning how to trust her own judgment about people. It had taught her one thing with absolute clarity. People who wanted something from you were very, very good at pretending they wanted nothing at all, which was exactly why Alex Carter, in his too big jacket and his scuffed boots with his empty pockets and his careful, grateful manners, felt so safe. He had nothing to gain from her. He had by every visible measure less than she did. There was nothing in his hands but a toolbox and a folded slip of paper with his schedule on it. She did not know, could not have known, standing in that warm little cafe, with the rain still streaking the windows, that the safety she felt was built on a lie so large it had its own PR department. The lie almost came apart on a Wednesday 3 weeks in over something as small as a broken pastry case latch. Harper had wedged her fingers into the mechanism, trying to free a jammed door, when Alex appeared at her elbow, with a screwdriver already in hand as though he'd sensed the problem from 2 floors away. "Let me," he said, and their hands brushed just barely. Just the backs of their knuckles as he took the tool from her, and something electric and entirely unbidden shot up Harper's arm. She stepped back, startled. He froze too. Screwdriver hovering eyes flicking to hers with an expression she could not read want, and warning both at once tangled together so tightly it looked almost like pain. "Sorry," he said quickly. "No, Harper laughed, embarrassed, pressing her palm flat against her own chest, as if she could physically hold her heartbeat in place. "It's fine. It's a screwdriver, not a... It's fine." He fixed the latch in 90 seconds, precise and economical, the way he did everything. But afterward, wiping his hands on a rag, he said quietly, not quite looking at her, "Can I ask you something, Harper?" "Sure. Why do you keep being kind to me?" He said it plainly without self-pity, like a man genuinely trying to solve an equation. "I'm the maintenance guy. Most people in this building don't know my name." Harper considered the question seriously because she could see he wanted a real answer, not a polite one. "Because you notice things," she said finally. "You notice the crooked sign nobody else complained about for 2 years. You notice Doreen like the radio station Walter plays. You notice everything except how much you matter to the people around you. I think that's worth being kind to." Something moved across his face, gratitude so sharp it looked for one unguarded second almost like grief. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly. It wasn't a challenge. It sounded, if anything, like an apology he didn't yet have the right words for. I know enough, Harper said. I know you stayed 40 minutes past your shift to fix a broken compressor and wouldn't take a tip for it. That tells me plenty. He looked at her a long moment, rain-gray light falling across his face through the tall windows, and Harper felt for the first time in 3 careful years the unmistakable, dangerous, wonderful sensation of a door in her chest creaking open. I have to get back to work, he said, finally, voice a little unsteady. Alex! He turned back. Thanks for the latch, she said and smiled. He didn't smile back right away. He just looked at her memorizing something, it seemed, storing it away for later before he nodded and walked back toward the service corridor, toolbox in hand, carrying with him a secret so large it would eventually shake the foundations of the very tower he was standing in. The regulars noticed him too in their own quiet ways. There was Gordon Pruitt, a rumpled insurance adjuster from the 31st floor who came down every day at 10 for a black coffee and a complaint about the Longhorns' defense, and who started including Alex in his sports commentary the way you include someone in a family argument, not because they've earned a vote, but because their presence has simply become expected. There was a pair of twin sisters from the graphic design firm on 6 Nadia and Brie Okafor who teased Alex mercilessly about his taste in flannel, and within 3 weeks had begun saving him the good almond croissant before the mid-morning rush cleaned the case out. There was even Desmond Whitfield himself on the rare mornings he came down, instead of sending an assistant who looked through Alex the way he looked through every service worker in the building. A blank, dismissive glance that registered a uniform rather than a person, and moved on without a flicker of recognition. Harper noticed that particular blindness and thought nothing of it at the time. She would think of it very differently months later once she understood exactly how much that blindness had cost her. You've got a fan club, Priya told Alex one Thursday, nodding at the small cluster of regulars who'd claimed the window table specifically because he was scheduled to fix a loose floor tile nearby that afternoon. Never seen this place run a betting pool on whether the maintenance guy would show before noon. I didn't realize I was a spectator sport, Alex said, though he looked, Harper thought, quietly pleased rather than embarrassed. Small building, small world, Priya said. People notice when somebody's decent. It's rarer than you'd think. If someone walked into your life looking completely ordinary, would you judge them by what they owned or by how they treated the people no one else bothered to see? Keep that question in your pocket. You're going to need it. Watch that word rarer. Hold on to it. Because the same building that let a billionaire disappear into a uniform without anyone questioning it was about to teach Harper exactly how dangerous ordinary blindness could become once someone with far less honorable intentions decided to use it. Because that evening, as Harper was closing the cafe, wiping down the last table and humming along to the radio, she happened to glance up in time to see Alex Carter, toolbox in hand. Jacket still, 2 big boots still scuffed. Walked directly past the public elevator bank badge, a restricted panel she'd never once seen a maintenance worker use, and step into the private executive elevator reserved, according to the small brass plaque beside it, for office of the chief executive only. Harper stood very still, rag forgotten in her hand. Alex, she called out softly, more to herself than to him. He didn't hear her, or didn't let himself. The brushed steel doors slid shut between them with a soft final chime, and Harper Lane stood alone in the darkening lobby, staring at her own faint reflection in the polished elevator doors, feeling the first small cold thread of a question she was not yet ready to pull. Something was wrong, or something was about to change. She would spend the whole night telling herself it was probably nothing. She would be wrong. For 3 days, Harper told herself she had imagined it. Maybe there had been an emergency. Maybe a pipe had burst on the executive floor and maintenance had been called up, badge and all, to handle it. That happened sometimes, didn't it? Building emergencies didn't respect an org chart. But Alex arrived the next morning exactly as he always did, quiet and rain-damp and grateful for his coffee. And when she asked, carefully, casually, whether everything upstairs had been all right, he went very still for half a second before saying, "Just a maintenance call, nothing serious," in a voice so smooth and practiced that some small, previously silent part of Harper's mind, the part that had learned 3 years ago to listen for exactly this kind of smoothness, quietly noted it and set it aside. She didn't push. She told herself that not pushing was kindness was respect for his privacy was the opposite of the suspicious controlling behavior she'd sworn she would never inflict on another person after watching what suspicion had done to her own parents' marriage. She told herself a great many reasonable things. Mostly, though, she wanted to keep believing in him. She had not let herself want something this simply, this hopefully, in 3 years, and she was not eager to examine why a locked elevator mattered more than it should. So she let it go. Mostly. But they started spending time together outside the tower almost by accident. It began with a Tuesday, when Alex's shift ended the same minute Harper's did, and a sudden hard rain sent them both scrambling under the narrow awning outside the loading dock, laughing soaked, sharing the only dry 6 feet of pavement in the whole plaza. "This building has excellent architecture for everything except keeping people dry," Alex said, water dripping off his jaw. 52 stories and nobody thought to make the awning bigger than a bus stop, Harper agreed. Genius work, whoever designed this place. Something flickered across his face. Amusement laced with something else. Something almost like private irony. But he said nothing, just laughed. A real laugh this time, easy and unguarded. And Harper thought, I could listen to that for the rest of my life. And was so startled by the thought that she nearly missed the bus she'd been waiting for. "I'll walk you to the bus stop," he offered, instead of pointing out that she'd have caught it if she'd paid attention. "I don't have anywhere to be." He said that a lot, Harper would notice over the following weeks. "I don't have anywhere to be." It struck her as sad at first, a man with no family waiting, no friends expecting him. Nothing pulling him home except an empty apartment. She didn't yet understand that it was in its own strange way the most honest thing he told her all autumn for those few hours after his shift ended, walking beside her through the rain-slick streets of downtown Austin. Alexander Wolfe genuinely did not have anywhere else he needed to be. For the first time in 19 years of board meetings and investor calls and product launches that ran past midnight, nothing mattered more than the sound of Harper Lane's laugh. They fell into a rhythm. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, they walked the 2 miles along Lady Bird Lake past the joggers and the food trucks and the college kids with their guitars talking about nothing and everything. He asked about her childhood in Georgetown, about her grandmother who'd taught her to make pie crust by feel instead of measurement, about the cafe she dreamed of opening herself one day. Small, warm, unpretentious, a place where the bar regulars could linger over 1 cup of coffee for 3 hours without anyone hurrying them along. "I'd call it the Kettle," she told him one evening, embarrassed at how much she was revealing. "Stupid name." "It's not stupid," he said, and something in his voice made her look over at him. He was watching the lake jaw tight, like he was working very hard to keep something contained. "It's the kind of place people need. Somewhere that isn't trying to sell them anything except a little peace and quiet." "You say that like you know something about needing a place like that." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know a lot about places that are only trying to sell you something," he said finally. "I don't know very many that aren't." She wanted to ask what he meant. She always wanted to ask with Alex. There was a whole locked room behind his eyes that she could feel more than see, a weight he carried that had nothing to do with a maintenance salary. But every time she got close to the door of that room, he would gently, deftly change the subject, ask her something about herself instead, listen with an intensity that made her feel like the only interesting person in Austin, and she would forget for a while that she'd been trying to ask anything at all. It was, she would later realize, a very old skill of his, the skill of a man who had spent 2 decades in rooms full of people trying to extract information from him and had learned long before he ever met her exactly how to give warmth without giving away ground. She only knew that autumn that she had never felt more listened to in her life. Fun. The invitations began arriving in October, not to Harper, but around her, brushing against the edges of her days in ways she barely registered until later. The tower's East Conference Room, usually reserved for tenant meetings, was suddenly booked for 2 full days by external consultants and cordoned off with a temporary badge access panel. Harper noticed a small parade of unfamiliar men in expensive suits moving through the lobby that week, murmuring into phones, looking anxious in the specific way that only very well-paid people manage to look anxious. "Merger talk," Priya said knowingly, ringing up a latte for one of them. "There's a rumor going around that Meridian's about to get bought out, or maybe it's the other way, that they're buying somebody. Either way, everybody upstairs is losing their minds because nobody can find the CEO." Harper's ears pricked at that, though she couldn't have said exactly why. What do you mean, find him? Alexander Wolfe. Priya said the name the way she might say a celebrity's half reverent, half gossipy. Apparently he's gone dark. No public appearances in like 3 weeks. There was a whole thing on the business channel this morning. Some analysts speculating he had a breakdown, or he's secretly selling the company, or he's dying of some rare disease. You know how they get. Harper laughed, distracted, wiping down the counter. People love a mystery. People love a rich, handsome mystery, Priya corrected. I looked him up once. Objectively unfair how good-looking a guy gets to be on top of all that money. Harper had genuinely never looked. The town hall video played in a loop on the east wall, and she had walked past it roughly 1,000 times without once really registering the man's face the way you stop hearing a song after it's played in a store for the 400th time. She glanced at it now, almost idly catching the tail end of the loop, a man in a charcoal suit composed poised, saying something about building infrastructure people can actually trust, to an auditorium of applause, and felt nothing. No spark of recognition, no warning bell. The video was 18 months old. The man in it had a full beard, wire-rimmed glasses, and hair swept back and styled by someone whose entire job was making him look like the future of American technology. He looked nothing at all like a clean-shaven, tired-eyed maintenance worker in a jacket 2 sizes too big. That was, of course, entirely the point. The following Tuesday, walking along the lake, Harper worked up the courage to ask the question she'd been circling for weeks. Can I ask you something? And you can tell me it's none of my business. Alex's shoulders tensed just slightly the way they always did before a hard question. Okay. That night a few weeks back, I saw you get into the executive elevator, the one with the plaque. She kept her eyes on the water, giving him room the way she'd have wanted room herself. You don't have to explain anything. I worry sometimes that you're in some kind of trouble, that someone's making you do something you don't want to do. He stopped walking. For a moment, Harper thought she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd pushed too hard against the locked door, and it was going to swing open onto something she wasn't prepared for. His jaw worked. His hands, usually so steady, curled and uncurled at his sides. I'm not in trouble, he said finally quietly. I promise you that. Whatever else is true about me, Harper, I am not in danger and I'm not doing anything wrong. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were so full of something raw and pleading that her breath caught. There are things about my life I haven't told you, not because I don't trust you, because I'm terrified of what happens the moment I do. What could possibly be that bad? That's the thing, he said with a small broken laugh that had no humor in it at all. It's not bad. It's just big. Bigger than anything I know how to hand someone gently. And every single time in my life I've handed it to someone, it's changed how they look at me. It's changed what they want from me. I haven't had... He stopped, pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his eyes. I haven't had many people look at me the way you do. Like I'm just a person. I don't want to lose that yet. I know that's selfish. I know I owe you honesty. I'm asking you for a little more time before I take that risk. Harper studied his face for a long moment, the exhaustion in it, the fear, the naked want to be trusted without conditions, and made a decision that would define the rest of the year for better and for devastating worse. Okay, she said softly. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. He exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for a year. Thank you, he whispered. She would think about that conversation 100 times in the weeks to come, turning it over like a stone, looking for the cracks she should have seen. It's not bad. It's just big. She had heard those words as reassurance. She had not yet understood they were also in their own way a confession. November brought the first real cold snap of the year, and with it one perfect ordinary evening that Harper would later hold on to like a life raft. Alex showed up at the cafe 40 minutes before closing with a small paper bag and an expression of fragile, hopeful mischief she'd never seen on him before. I made something, he said, setting the bag on the counter. Or I attempted something. I want to be honest about the confidence level here. Inside was a slightly lopsided but genuinely delicious loaf of banana bread, still faintly warm. You bake. I'm learning, he said. There's a woman 2 floors up from my apartment who's been teaching me. She reminds me of my mother a little. Something flickered across his face, grief quickly hidden. I wanted to bring you something that wasn't just me showing up empty-handed for once. Harper cut 2 slices, and they sat together on the low windowsill of the darkened cafe. The plaza outside lit gold and blue by streetlights, and ate banana bread with their fingers like teenagers. This is genuinely good, Alex. Don't sound so surprised. I'm allowed to be surprised. You fix elevators and you bake.
What else are you hiding? Do you also play the cello?
His laugh cracked sudden and real, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would spend months afterward trying to name tenderness. Yes, but also something that looked almost like grief for a happiness he already suspected he couldn't keep. Harper, he said quietly, I need you to know something. Whatever happens, whatever you find out about me, eventually, this part was real. This exact thing right here. This is the realest thing that's happened to me in years. That's an oddly specific thing to say over banana bread. I mean it specifically, he said, and reached over gently to brush a crumb from the corner of her mouth, his fingers lingering half a second longer than the task required. The air between them went taut and electric. Harper's heart slammed against her ribs. Alex, I know, he said softly, withdrawing his hand like it had cost him something to do it. I know I said, I need time. I meant it. I'm not going to kiss you in a dark coffee shop with half a story still hidden from you. You deserve better than half a story. He stood a little abruptly, gathering himself. But I wanted you to know, in case I run out of time to say it later, this is real Harper. Whatever else turns out to be true. He left soon after, and Harper sat alone in the dark cafe for a long time, fingers pressed to her lips, where his hand had almost been feeling the unmistakable, terrifying lift of falling in love with a man she was only just beginning to realize she did not fully know. She had no way of knowing that 60 floors above her, in a soundproofed boardroom, 7 members of Meridian Systems' executive board were at that very moment voting on an emergency resolution to force their missing CEO's hand, giving him 1 week to publicly resurface or face a formal removal proceeding that would strip him of control over the company he'd built from a garage with a soldering iron and a library book. 1 week. That was all the time Alex Carter had left to be nobody but himself.
Person.
Harper had no way of knowing it, but she had already crossed paths unknowingly with the man who would soon turn her name into a headline. Marcus Feld was a business reporter for the Austin Statesman Ledger, 44 years old, rumpled in the specific way of a man who had once cared deeply about his appearance and had since redirected all that energy into chasing stories nobody else wanted to dig for. He had been quietly investigating irregularities in Meridian's retirement fund for the better part of a year, working off a single anonymous tip and a stubborn refusal to let a good instinct go cold. He came into Common Grounds most Fridays, ordered a plain drip coffee, and sat in the corner with a laptop and a legal pad watching the lobby traffic with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who had learned that most interesting stories revealed themselves to people who were simply willing to sit still long enough. He had noticed Alex, too. The quiet maintenance worker who always seemed to know precisely which supply closets required badge overrides, who moved through restricted corridors with a confidence that didn't quite match his uniform. Marcus filed the observation away, the way he filed away everything in a mental drawer labeled maybe nothing, and went back to cross-referencing wire transfers. You always this quiet a customer? Harper asked him once, refilling his cup without being asked the way she did for anyone who looked like they needed the excuse to stay a little longer. Occupational hazard, Marcus said. I spend most of my life watching people who don't know I'm watching. Makes for lousy small talk. What are you watching for in a coffee shop? He'd smiled non-committal, tapping his pen against the legal pad. Whatever doesn't add up. You'd be amazed how often it's hiding somewhere boring. Harper had laughed and moved on to the next table, thinking nothing more of it. She would remember that exchange months later with a chill that had nothing to do with the cafe's air conditioning. The reporter who would eventually break the story that saved her reputation had been sitting 8 feet away from the man at the center of it all, sipping drip coffee for weeks before either of them knew the other existed.
What?
60 floors above her, the tension Harper couldn't see was tightening by the day. 19 days, Renata. Desmond Whitfield's voice, smooth as poured concrete, carried down the executive hallway from behind a half-closed door. 19 days, and the board is starting to ask questions I can't keep answering for him. Either he shows his face or we vote without him in the room. He'll be at the shareholders' meeting. Renata set her tone carefully, even the tone of a woman who had spent 2 decades learning not to hand Desmond Whitfield anything he could use. You'll have your answer Thursday. I certainly hope so. A pause silk over something harder underneath. Because I'd hate for anyone to start asking why the CFO's quarterly reconciliations have needed 3 separate corrections this year. Wouldn't want that kind of scrutiny landing on the wrong desk while everyone's busy worrying about Alexander's whereabouts. Renata said nothing to that. though she made a note later that evening in a private file she had been keeping for months, a file that would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence Marcus Feld ever laid hands on. Neither Whitfield nor Renata knew yet that Harper Lane, a woman neither of them had ever met, was about to become the innocent center of the very storm they were each maneuvering to survive. Because Thursday, everything Alexander had built to protect thousands of strangers was about to collide catastrophically with the one relationship he'd built to protect nobody but himself. The board's ultimatum reached him the following morning, delivered by his longtime chief of staff, a sharp, weary woman named Renata Cole, who found him still in his gray maintenance uniform in the freight elevator's small service closet coiling cable. "They're serious this time, Alexander," Renata said without preamble, closing the closet door behind her. "Whitfield's got 4 board votes lined up. If you don't appear at the shareholders' meeting next Thursday, they will move to remove you for cause. 19 years, and Whitfield's finally got the leverage he's been circling for a decade." Alex set down the coil of cables slowly. "I need until Thursday." "You have until Thursday. That's what I'm telling you." Renata studied him. The calloused hands, the changed haircut, the tired peace in his face that she hadn't seen in years. "Alexander, whoever she is, I hope she's worth what this is about to cost you." He didn't answer right away. Outside the closet door faintly, he could hear the familiar sound of the cafe's espresso machine starting its morning cycle, and beneath it, unmistakable even through 2 walls, Harper's laugh. "She's worth more than the company," he said quietly. "I just haven't figured out yet how to make her believe that once she knows who I really am." Renata's expression softened just slightly, the way it hadn't in years. "Then I hope you figure it out fast," she said, "because Thursday the whole world finds out anyway, and I don't think you get to choose how she hears it." She was right. He didn't. Wednesday, the day before the shareholders' meeting, began like any other and ended with Harper Lane's entire understanding of her own life quietly folding in on itself. It started small. Harper had promised to help Walter Higgs sort through a storage closet on the 4th floor that the property management company wanted, cleared for a new copy room, decades of old blueprints, outdated tenant contracts, and dusty binders nobody had touched since the building's original construction. Walter's knees weren't what they used to be, and Harper had offered to help on her lunch break, glad for an excuse to stretch her legs, and glad if she was honest with herself for a distraction from the strange humming anticipation she'd been carrying since Alex's confession over banana bread. Boxes and boxes of paper. Mold-spotted lease agreements. A framed photograph of the tower's original groundbreaking ceremony 12 years old. A much younger man in a hard hat, holding an oversized pair of ceremonial scissors, laughing at something off camera. Harper wiped the dust off the glass. "Mildly curious the way you're curious about any old photograph." The man in the hard hat had a full beard, but something about his eyes tugged faintly at a thread she couldn't place. "That's the original groundbreaking?" Walter said, not looking up from the box he was sorting. 12 years back before your time, before mine even. Company practically built this whole block." "Which company?" "Meridian." Walter said it like it was obvious, because to him it was. "Wolfe Tower. Named for the fella in the picture." Harper looked at the photograph again more carefully this time, and a strange cold prickle moved slowly up the back of her neck. Beard. Different haircut, 12 years younger. But the eyes. She set the photograph down and, telling herself she was being ridiculous, reached instead for the nearest binder, a thick property ownership file tabbed and labeled in careful legal handwriting. Leaseholding entity. Wolfe Tower Partners. LLC. Sole managing member A. Wolfe. She flipped further because some instinct she didn't fully understand yet wouldn't let her stop. Building permits. Insurance filings. A payroll authorization list for building maintenance staff dated 3 weeks earlier, requiring executive-level sign-off for a temporary contractor hire. At the bottom of the authorization form, beneath a line of dense legal boilerplate, was a signature, Alexander Wolfe, and beneath the signature in smaller print, a note that made Harper's whole body go cold. New hire cleared for building access under contractor ID. A. Carter, per personal directive of A. Wolfe. Direct approval requested and granted same day. Her hands were unsteady as she turned back a page, then forward, again searching for some other explanation her mind could hold on to. A typo, a mismatched form. Anything that would let the last 2 months stay exactly as soft and simple as she'd believed them to be. There was none. The signature was consistent across 4 separate documents, the same careful slanted hand, each time cross-referenced against a corporate seal that Walter, glancing over without much interest, confirmed was the real one, not some copy seen it 100 times on the building permits. Harper sat very still on an overturned box in a dusty storage closet, the binder open on her lap, and felt the entire architecture of the last 2 months rearrange itself around her silently, brick by brick. Alex Carter had hired himself. Harper, Walter's voice distant, concerned. You've gone white as a sheet girl. You all right? She wasn't. She didn't know yet how not all right she was about to become. She told herself, walking numbly back down to the lobby, that there had to be an explanation. Maybe Alex worked for someone connected to the Wolfe family. Maybe it was a coincidence of names. Wolfe wasn't that uncommon. A surname, was it? Maybe. She stopped in front of the east lobby wall where the town hall video played on its eternal loop, and for the first time in 4 years, she actually watched it. Really watched it. A man in a charcoal suit, bearded glasses, hair swept back by a stylist's careful hand, speaking with easy, practiced confidence about human-centered infrastructure to an auditorium of applauding employees. She stared at his eyes, tired, deep blue, the kind of blue that had seen more than it wanted to say. The espresso cup slipped from Harper's fingers and shattered on the marble floor, and the sound seemed to come from very far away. Harper! Priya was at her elbow, instantly alarmed. Hey, what's wrong? You're shaking. Harper couldn't answer. She was still staring at the screen at the loop, restarting at the man's face, saying the same practiced words it had said 10,000 times before to 10,000 strangers who never once saw past the beard and the glasses and the styled hair to the tired, ordinary eyes underneath. Alexander Wolfe, the billionaire. The missing CEO, the news channels had been speculating about for 3 weeks. The man whose signature was on the authorization form that had hired a maintenance contractor named a Carter. Alex. She thought wildly, absurdly for one desperate half-second of every kind explanation her heart could invent. He works for him. He's a relative. There's been some mistake. She thought of the banana bread and his hand brushing the crumb from her lip, and this is the realest thing that's happened to me in years, and she wanted so badly to believe there was an innocent version of this story that her whole chest ached with the wanting. And then, as if summoned by the cruelest possible timing in the universe, the lobby's wall-mounted television, tuned as always to the building's business news feed, cut away from its regular programming to a live special report. Breaking Meridian Systems, CEO Alexander Wolfe to make first public appearance in 3 weeks at tomorrow's shareholder meeting. The crawl read beneath live footage of a stage being prepared in a downtown convention hall. A stage Harper registered with a lurch of pure vertigo in the very same building complex where Alex had disappeared into the executive elevator that first rainy evening. She didn't wait for tomorrow. She rode the freight elevator up badge, stolen shamelessly from Walter's supply cart, hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped it twice and stepped out onto the 52nd floor. For the first time in her life, into a wide, hushed atrium of glass offices and hurrying assistants, all of whom stopped briefly to stare at the barista in her Common Grounds apron, who had somehow appeared where she had no possible reason to be. She found him through an open door at the end of a long hallway, standing at a floor-to-ceiling window, in a room that could only be an executive office, dressed not in his worn canvas jacket, but in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, a phone pressed to his ear, mid-sentence, with someone about tomorrow's investor communications strategy. He turned. He saw her. The phone slipped from his hand. Harper. Her name in his mouth sounded exactly the same as it always had, careful, warm, like something worth protecting. That somehow was the cruelest part of all. Say it, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, though it shook at the edges. Say your name. Your whole name. He set down the phone with hands that were for the first time since she'd known him visibly unsteady. Harper, please let me explain. Say your name. A long, terrible silence. Behind him through the window, the Austin skyline stretched gold and gray in the late afternoon light, indifferent to the two people standing frozen in its shadow. Alexander Wolfe, he said finally quietly, like a confession dragged out from under years of careful concrete. My name is Alexander Wolfe. Harper felt something inside her chest crack cleanly in half. 2 months, she whispered.
2 months of coffee and banana bread and walking along the lake, and you telling me this was the realest thing that's happened to you in years, and the entire time you were lying about your own name.
I never lied about who I was with you, he said, taking a step toward her, stopping himself when she flinched back. Everything I told you, the way I feel about you, the person you got to know, that was real Harper. The only thing I hid was a title.
A title. Her laugh came out broken, disbelieving. You didn't hide a title, Alexander, whoever you are. You hid a company worth billions of dollars. You hid an empire. You let me fall for a man who doesn't exist while the actual man watched from behind a mask, deciding week after week whether I'd passed some kind of test.
It was never a test.
Wasn't it? Her voice cracked on the word. Wasn't that exactly what it was? A very expensive, very elaborate test to see if a woman would love you without knowing what you're worth. Congratulations, Mr. Wolfe. I passed. I hope it was everything you hoped for.
Harper, please, don't. The single word came out with a force that stopped him cold. Tears stood bright and furious in her eyes, refusing out of pure stubbornness to fall in front of him. I fell in love with a maintenance worker who fixed broken things because he cared, not because it made a headline. I don't know if that man is real. I don't know if any of it was real. And I can't stand here and figure that out with billions of dollars and a national news crawl staring at me from every direction. She turned and walked out past the hurrying assistants, past the wide glass offices, into the freight elevator, and did not let herself cry until the doors had closed and she was alone, sinking to the floor of the small metal box, pressing both hands over her mouth to keep the sound in. Behind her in the office, with the floor-to-ceiling window, Alexander Wolfe stood very still for a long time, looking at the door she'd walked through before he picked up the phone he'd dropped, and in a voice utterly without its earlier warmth, said the 6 words that would set the rest of this story in motion. Get Renata, I need the files. Because Harper Lane did not know, could not have known, storming out of that office with her heart in pieces on the floor, that the reason Alexander Wolfe had spent 2 months disguised as a maintenance worker had never really been about romance at all. Not at first. It had started 4 months earlier with a spreadsheet that didn't add up, and a quiet private terror that someone inside his own company was stealing from thousands of employees who trusted him with their retirement accounts. He had built the disguise to catch a thief. He simply hadn't planned on falling in love along the way, or on the thief using Harper. Innocent, furious, broken-hearted Harper as the perfect scapegoat the moment the walls started closing in. The story broke by Thursday morning, and it broke ugly. Billionaire? CEO's secret romance with barista exposed. Read one headline beside a grainy photograph taken, Harper would later learn, by a junior analyst with a phone camera and a tip line's worth of ambition, of her and Alex sitting on the cafe windowsill the night of the banana bread heads, close together, looking in the flattened cruelty of a stolen photograph, exactly like a scheming woman and her wealthy mark. Who is Harper Lane? Asked another, beneath a photo of the cafe pulled from an old business listing, the tone of the article managing in 600 words to imply gold-digging manipulation and premeditation without once printing a single verified fact. Priya found Harper hiding in the back storeroom before her shift phone buzzing uncontrollably in her apron pocket with texts from her sister, her mother, 2 old college roommates she hadn't spoken to in years, all asking some version of the same disbelieving question. Is this real? Were you really dating him? I didn't know. Harper said over and over to Priya, to her manager, to her own reflection in the storeroom's cracked mirror. I swear to God I didn't know. I believe you, Priya said fiercely, gripping both her hands. Anybody who's watched you two moon over each other for 2 months knows this wasn't some scheme. You didn't even know his last name. That, unfortunately, was not a defense the internet found remotely compelling. By Thursday afternoon, Harper's face pulled from her own long-neglected social media an old photo from 3 years back before Trevor. Before any of this was circulating beneath captions that ranged from mockingly sympathetic to viciously certain. She was a con artist. She was an innocent victim. She was depending entirely on which corner of the internet you asked, either the villain or the fool of a story she hadn't even known she was starring in. She did not go to the shareholders' meeting. She could not have imagined a single reason to. She learned what happened there secondhand in fragments, the way you learn about a storm after it's already passed through your town from the news. From Priya's breathless updates, from a shaking, disbelieving phone call from Renata Cole, whom she had never met and had no earthly reason to trust, except that something in the woman's voice, calm and precise, even through evident strain, made Harper listen.
Alexander announced his resignation, Renata said without preamble. This morning, live in front of the full board and every major business journalist in the state. Harper sat down hard on the edge of her bed. What?
He stood up in front of 600 shareholders and told them he was stepping down as CEO of the company he built from nothing effective, immediately pending an independent investigation. A pause. He also told them why he'd been missing for 3 weeks. Harper, I don't think you understand what you walked away from yet. I don't think you have the full picture, and I don't think it's fair for you to be making decisions about him without it. I have plenty of picture, Harper said, throat tight. I have a picture of a man who let me fall in love with a lie. You have a picture of half the story, Renata said, not unkindly. The other half is why he was pretending to be a maintenance worker in the first place. And I'd think very hard if I were you about whether you want to hear it from me or from him. Harper hung up without answering. She did not sleep that night. The other half of the story, as it turned out, was already unraveling. Not gently, not on Alexander's timeline, but violently in the worst possible way, less than 48 hours after his resignation. It began with an anonymous tip to a business journalist named Marcus Feld, who had spent 9 months quietly investigating irregularities in Meridian's employee retirement fund money that on paper had been invested conservatively in low-risk index funds and that had in reality been systematically siphoned through a shell company into the personal accounts of 3 senior executives, including the company's longtime CFO, a smooth, silver-haired man named Desmond Whitfield, who had not coincidentally spent the last several months publicly pushing the board to remove Alexander for erratic behavior and instability unbecoming of a public company's leadership. It was Whitfield, in fact, who had first noticed the fund discrepancies 4 months earlier, not because he'd stumbled onto evidence of the theft, but because he had committed it and had panicked when Alexander, going through routine quarterly reports, asked one too many precise, uncomfortable questions about a vendor payment that didn't add up. Rather than risk exposure, Whitfield had done the only thing he knew how to do. Well, he'd built a narrative. He'd spent months quietly suggesting to the board that their CEO was cracking under pressure, unstable, unreliable, a man who needed to be removed before his erratic decisions damaged the company further. He needed Alexander gone, discredited, and unable to finish tracing the money before Whitfield could finish covering his tracks. Alexander, for his part, had suspected Whitfield almost from the beginning. The timing was too clean, the sudden campaign against him too coordinated, but suspecting was not proving, and a public accusation against a sitting CFO without ironclad evidence would have destroyed Meridian's stock price and thousands of employees' retirement savings right along with it. He needed to move quietly. He needed access to systems and conversations that a CEO visibly hunting for a thief would never be given, but that an anonymous, unremarkable contractor badged into low-level maintenance systems with just enough access to plant a few careful audit tools absolutely would. It had started 4 months ago as pure strategy, a disguise built for evidence gathering, nothing more. He had not expected Harper Lane and her free cup of coffee on a rainy Monday morning to turn a strategic disguise into the truest, gentlest, most terrifying thing that had happened to him in 19 years of building an empire alone. Now, with the disguise gone and the investigation blown wide open by his own public resignation, Whitfield had exactly one move left, and he made it without hesitation. He pointed the finger somewhere else. Fast. By Friday morning, a leaked internal memo, carefully worded, carefully anonymous, carefully timed, was making its way through business news channels, suggesting that Harper Lane, a woman with previous financial grievances and a documented personal relationship with the resigning CEO, had potential undisclosed knowledge of the fund irregularities, and that investigators were looking into the nature and timeline of her access to the building's restricted systems. It was on every factual level a lie built entirely out of true isolated facts arranged to point somewhere false. Harper had in fact badged into a restricted storage closet with Walter's card the day she'd found the ownership documents. Harper had in fact once dated a man with financial troubles years ago in a completely unrelated situation. Trevor's own bitter self-justifying interviews to local press about their broken engagement were now being dredged up and repackaged as evidence of a pattern. Harper had in fact been photographed in close, intimate conversation with the CEO on multiple occasions. None of it was true. All of it was technically accurate. That was Harper would learn precisely how the most effective lies were built. She lost 4 private catering bookings in one afternoon. Common Ground's corporate contract with the tower's property management group was placed under review pending clarification. Her own mother called, voice tight with worry rather than accusation, to ask gently whether there was anything Harper needed to tell her.
I didn't do anything, Harper said for what felt like the 1,000th time that week, sitting alone on her apartment floor at 11 at night, phone screen glowing with headlines she couldn't stop reading. I didn't do anything, and everyone's decided I did. She was still sitting there, exhausted past tears, when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. I know you don't want to hear from me. I'm not calling to defend myself. I'm calling because you're about to be hurt by something you had no part in, and I built the situation that's about to hurt you. Please let me fix that much, even if you never forgive me for the rest. Alexander. She stared at the message for a long time. Then, almost against her own will, she typed back 3 words. Fix it then.
But
He moved fast once she gave him that much. Within 36 hours, working with Marcus Feld, with Renata Cole, and with a forensic accounting team, he'd quietly retained the moment he first suspected Whitfield. 4 months earlier, Alexander released not to a friendly outlet, not through a carefully managed PR firm, but directly publicly in a live-streamed press conference from Meridian's own headquarters, every piece of evidence he had spent 4 months gathering. Bank transfer records tracing the shell company back to accounts controlled by Desmond Whitfield and 2 co-conspirators in the finance department. Internal emails recovered by the maintenance-level audit tools Alexander had planted himself, showing Whitfield coordinating the smear campaign against both the CEO and later against Harper in explicit damning detail. A timeline laid out cleanly for every journalist in the room, showing that Harper Lane's only access to any restricted system had been a single innocent visit to a dusty storage closet with a 70-year-old janitor looking for old blueprints on a day she had no possible way of knowing what she'd find. I built a false identity to catch a man I suspected of stealing from thousands of employees who trusted this company with their futures, Alexander said, standing alone at the podium. No notes, no teleprompter, his voice steady even as the cameras flashed relentlessly. That was my choice, and I stand by the reasons I made it, even if I regret how much it cost the people around me. But Harper Lane is not part of this story, except as someone I hurt with my own dishonesty. She had no knowledge of the fund irregularities. She had no knowledge of my identity until the same day the rest of you learned it. The only crime Harper Lane is guilty of is trusting a man who didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt he was asking her for. I will not let her pay the price for protecting a company she's never even been an employee of. The moment that would later run on every business news channel for a week happened almost by accident near the end of the press conference, when a journalist near the back of the room Marcus Feld notebook, already half-filled voice pitched to Carrie, called out a question nobody had prepared Alexander for. Mr. Wolfe Desmond Whitfield is standing 4 feet behind you. Does he have anything to say to that timeline you just laid out? The room went very quiet. Every camera swung toward Whitfield, who had been standing near the wings of the stage for the entire press conference, arms crossed, jaw tight, having assumed evidently that his own presence there would read as confidence rather than desperation. This is a witch hunt, Whitfield said, stepping forward before anyone could stop him, his composure fraying visibly under the lights. Alexander disappears for 3 weeks, comes back with some elaborate story about a disguise, and now suddenly I'm the villain. Ask yourselves who actually benefits from this narrative. I'm not asking anyone to take my word for it, Alexander said, turning to face him directly, his own voice remaining level, even as something hard and unyielding entered it. I'm asking them to look at the transfer records, the ones with your authorization codes on them, Desmond, the ones dated 11 months before you ever started suggesting to the board that I was unstable. He held up a single printed page, not for Whitfield, but for the cameras. I spent 4 months building a disguise because I didn't trust that I could get this evidence any other way without you burying it first. I was right not to trust that. You'd already started the smear campaign against Harper Lane before I even finished compiling this. You don't know what you're talking about. I have the emails, Desmond. Alexander's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The ones where you discussed redirecting attention toward the barista with your outside counsel. I have timestamps. I have your own words. This ends today one way or another,
and I'd rather it end with the truth than with an innocent woman's name dragged through it for one more news cycle, because you needed somewhere else to point. Whitfield's composure finally cracked all the way through, not into confession, but into the ugly cornered anger of a man who had run out of moves. Security escorted him from the stage within minutes, his protests trailing behind him down the hallway, and the room erupted into a storm of shouted questions that Alexander answered patiently, one at a time, for another 40 minutes, never once raising his voice, never once losing the composure of a man who had finally stopped hiding from anything. Desmond Whitfield was arrested 2 days later, along with the company's controller and a mid-level finance manager, on charges of securities fraud, embezzlement, and wire fraud, in a case that would eventually recover nearly $210 million from Meridian's retirement fund. The board, in a swift and unanimous vote, reinstated Alexander as CEO within the week, though he would later tell Renata privately that he'd almost said no. Harper's name disappeared from the headlines almost as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by Whitfield's mugshot and a fresh cycle of corporate scandal coverage that had nothing to do with her at all. Her catering contracts were quietly reinstated. The property management group sent a stiff, unenthusiastic apology email that Priya printed out just to set it on fire in the cafe's back parking lot, which Harper allowed on the grounds that some things deserved a small ceremony. But Alexander did not call her after the press conference. He did not show up at the cafe with banana bread or apologies or grand gestures. He sent one more text 3 days after Whitfield's arrest, and then nothing at all. I meant what I said publicly. None of what happened to you was fair, and I'm sorrier than I know how to say. I'm not going to keep reaching out. You deserve to decide without any more pressure from me whether you ever want to hear from Alexander Wolfe again. If the answer is no, I'll understand and I won't ask twice. Harper read that message perhaps 30 times over the following week, in the quiet hours after closing, wiping down a counter that didn't need wiping, glancing too often at a door that no longer opened at 6:45 every morning to reveal a man in a jacket 2 sizes too big. She missed him. That was the maddening, undeniable truth underneath all her justified anger. She missed Alex Carter, the version of him who fixed broken latches and brought lopsided banana bread and asked about her grandmother's pie crust, like it was the most important subject in the world. She was not certain yet whether that man had only ever been a costume, or whether he had been the truest version of Alexander Wolfe that existed the 119 years of boardrooms and headlines had slowly buried until a rainy Monday morning and a free cup of coffee dug him back out. She did not yet have an answer, but 4 months of watching a man rebuild his own integrity, brick by careful brick in full public view, without asking her for anything in return, was slowly, quietly changing the shape of the question. Winter came and went. Austin's brief, half-hearted cold snaps gave way to an early greening spring, and Harper Lane spent all of it doing the one thing she had promised herself: she would never again let a man's chaos derail building something entirely her own. She gave notice at Common Grounds in February, a decision that surprised no one who'd watched her run that little cafe for 4 years with more heart than the corporate lease technically required. She had savings, modest, hard-won, entirely hers, untouched by anything to do with Alexander Wolfe or his fortune, and a business plan she'd been quietly refining in notebooks for 3 years, ever since a rainy afternoon when she'd first said the words, "the kettle," out loud to a man in a maintenance uniform, and watched his face go soft with something like recognition. She found a space 6 blocks from the old tower, a narrow, sun-filled storefront that had been a failed bookstore, then an empty shell for 2 years with good bones and terrible plumbing, and a landlord willing to negotiate hard on rent in exchange for a 5-year lease. She took out a small business loan from her local credit union, the ordinary, unglamorous kind, with an interest rate that made her wince, and a repayment schedule she checked obsessively for the first 3 months. She refinished the counter herself with Priya's help, and 2 bottles of cheap wine and a YouTube tutorial that made the job look considerably easier than it turned out to be. She did not call Alexander Wolfe. Not once in 4 months, though. She thought about it more times than she would ever admit to anyone but her sister. He did not call her either, but she noticed things in the quiet way you notice a person keeping a promise they never announced. An anonymous donor's name never appeared attached to her small business loan, though her credit union manager mentioned almost in passing that a private foundation had recently expanded its microloan guarantee program for local women-owned businesses. The Cole Family Foundation for Community Enterprise funded, She learned much later entirely by Renata Cole's own personal savings at the specific and quiet request of a man who had asked for exactly one condition: that Harper's application be evaluated purely on its merits, with no acknowledgement given ever of where the guarantee had come from.
She heard through Priya, through Walter, through the small, persistent grapevine of the towers she'd left behind other things, too. That Alexander had personally overseen the full restitution of every retirement account touched by Whitfield's fraud, adding funds from his own pocket to cover the gap the recovered assets didn't fully close. That he'd instituted a new whistleblower protection policy company-wide, named quietly without fanfare. In a footnote, most employees never even noticed the Lane protocol. That he still came down some mornings to the small maintenance office to talk with Walter about the radio station, though he no longer wore a jacket 2 sizes too big to do it. He was, by every account she heard, still exactly the man who'd fixed a broken pastry case latch and refused a tip for staying 40 minutes past his shift. He had simply stopped hiding that man behind anyone else's name. She thought about that some nights more than she wanted to.
But she...
The kettle opened on a bright Saturday morning in early May, 11 months after a rainy Monday, and a free cup of coffee with a line of well-wishers stretching down the block. Priya, who'd quit her own job to come manage the register full-time. Doreen Foss, who arrived at 7:15 sharp, demanding a decaf Americano, and immediately declared the crossword corner criminally undersized. Walter Higgs, stooped and beaming, carrying a toolbox he insisted on using to fix a sticking door hinge before Harper could even offer him coffee. Harper stood behind her own counter in her own café, surrounded by the good, ordinary, hard-won people who had chosen to show up for her without a single billion-dollar complication attached, and felt for the first time in almost a year entirely and uncomplicatedly happy. She saw him before he saw her. Alexander stood at the back of the small crowd near the door, dressed simply. Jeans, a plain gray sweater. No suit, no security detail, no cameras trailing him. Holding a small, slightly imperfect bunch of wildflowers that looked endearingly like he'd picked them himself, and only belatedly worried they weren't fancy enough for the occasion. He didn't push forward. He waited patient at the edge of the crowd until the initial rush of well-wishers thinned and Priya, catching Harper's eye with a small knowing tilt of her head, took over the register without being asked. "I heard there was an opening today," Alexander said when he finally reached the counter, holding out the slightly wilted flowers with an expression of such careful, hopeful humility that Harper's chest ached. "I wasn't sure I was allowed to come. I bought coffee somewhere else first, just in case, so I wouldn't be presuming. Despite everything, despite 4 months of grief and headlines and a heart she'd worked so hard to protect." Harper laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her. "You bought coffee somewhere else to hedge your bets on whether you'd be welcome at my grand opening." "I panicked," he admitted. "It felt safer than showing up empty-handed and presumptuous both." She studied him for a long moment. No beard, no glasses, no styled hair. Just the same tired, honest blue eyes she'd first noticed on a rainy Monday morning, looking if anything more tired than they had a year ago, and more honest. "You've been busy," she said. "The Lane Protocol, the Loan Guarantee Program, Renata's foundation." His expression flickered, caught. "You weren't supposed to find out where that came from." "Small city, big gossip network. You should know that better than anyone by now." She wiped her hands on her apron, buying herself a second to steady her voice. "Why'd you do all of it? You already apologized publicly. You didn't owe me anything more." "I didn't do it because I owed you," he said quietly. "I did it because you were right. Every single thing you said in my office that day was right. I let you fall in love with a version of the truth instead of the whole truth, and I told myself it was for a good enough reason to make that okay. It wasn't. I've spent 4 months trying to become the kind of man who doesn't need a disguise to be worth loving." He set the flowers gently on the counter between them, not pushing them toward her, simply offering. "I'm not asking you to forgive that overnight, Harper. I'm not even asking you to forgive it today. I just didn't want to let your opening day pass without telling you honestly in my own name, standing right in front of you. I love you. I loved you as Alex Carter, and I love you exactly the same amount as Alexander Wolfe, because it was never the name that made it real. It was you. It was always just you." Harper's eyes filled despite every effort not to let them. "You can't just show up with wildflowers and a good speech and expect 4 months to unhappen." "I know," he said. "I'm not expecting anything. I'm hoping.
Those are different things, and I finally understand the difference because you taught it to me one honest cup of coffee at a time.
For a long moment, Harper said nothing at all, looking at the man in front of her. No jacket, 2 sizes too big. No billion-dollar company standing between them. Just Alexander plainly and completely himself, offering nothing but the truth and a slightly wilted bunch of wildflowers. "Come back Tuesday," she said finally softly. "I close at 6 on Tuesdays. We could walk by the lake, slowly. No secrets this time. No disguises." A small and steady smile. "You can tell me everything you left out the first time, all of it, and I'll decide one honest conversation at a time whether there's still a version of us worth building." Something in his face broke open relief and hope, and a joy so quiet and enormous it made him look for a moment exactly like the shy, grateful man who'd once thanked her twice for a free cup of coffee. "Tuesday," he said. "I'll be there at 6. I don't have anywhere else to be."
"You never do," Harper said, and this time when she smiled, it reached all the way to her eyes.
They walked by the lake every Tuesday and Thursday for the rest of that summer, and then the fall after it. And Alexander told her everything, every board meeting he'd missed to sit in a maintenance closet learning to rewire a panel, every sleepless night spent cross-referencing shell company transactions. Every moment of 19 years he'd spent so certain that no one could ever want him without wanting his money, that he'd built himself a life with almost no one in it at all. Harper told him things, too, about Trevor. Finally, the whole ugly truth of it. The bachelor party confession she'd overheard through a hotel wall 4 days before her wedding. The 6 months at her sister's house, relearning how to trust her own judgment. He listened the way he always had, completely, without trying to fix what didn't need fixing, just holding the weight of it with her. They rebuilt trust slowly, deliberately, the unglamorous way through small honesties rather than grand gestures. He learned to ask before assuming. She learned to voice a doubt out loud instead of quietly filing it away. Neither of them mistook the rebuilding for something that could be rushed. "I looked you up eventually," Harper admitted one Thursday in late July, the lake gone gold and hazy with evening heat, joggers thinning out as the light softened. "About a month after everything. I watched that old town hall video probably a dozen times trying to find you in it. The beard, the glasses, all of it. I couldn't. It was like looking at a stranger wearing your voice." "That man was a performance," Alexander said, watching a heron pick its way along the shallows. "Not a dishonest one exactly, just armored. Every word of it workshopped by 3 different consultants before I ever said it out loud. I don't think I said anything truly unrehearsed in a boardroom for almost a decade." He glanced at her, something rueful in it. "You got the unrehearsed version by accident because I was too busy trying not to get caught stealing evidence to remember to perform for you." Harper laughed, surprised. "That's a strange thing to be grateful for." "I'm grateful for all of it," he said quietly. "Even the parts that cost us both something. I don't know that I'd have ever found my way back to being an ordinary person otherwise. It took losing you to understand how much of myself I'd already lost long before you ever walked into that lobby." She reached over without quite deciding to and laced her fingers through his, the first time she'd initiated that particular closeness since the day the elevator doors closed between them. He went very still, like a man afraid to break something fragile by acknowledging it too loudly, and then slowly his hand tightened around hers. "Ask me something," she said. "Something you were always too careful to ask back when you were still Alex." He considered it, walking in silence for a few paces. "What made you decide that very first morning to give a soaked, awkward stranger a free coffee instead of just pointing him toward the service corridor and going back to your register?" Harper smiled, remembering the rain, the too big jacket, the careful way he'd hesitated over the price board. "You looked like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like for a stranger to be kind to you for no reason. I recognized that look. I'd worn it myself not that long before." After Trevor, she agreed. "I promised myself somewhere in those 6 months at my sister's house that if I ever saw that particular kind of loneliness in someone else, I wouldn't just walk past it. I didn't know it would turn out to be the single most complicated decision of my life. But I don't regret it. Not even the parts that hurt." Alexander stopped walking, entirely turning to face her, fully in the fading gold light, his expression open in a way she still wasn't quite used to even after months of practice. "I don't regret it either," he said. "Not one single part. Not the disguise, not the elevator, not the headlines.
If it took all of that to end up exactly here walking beside you being nobody but myself, I'd choose every difficult piece of it again. Almost a year to the day after that first rainy Monday on a clear gold October evening, Alexander arrived at the kettle just after closing carrying nothing but a single bunch of wildflowers. No ring box visible, no cameras, no security detail, exactly as ordinary as the very first bouquet he'd handed her at her opening. "I want to ask you something," he said once Priya had discreetly flipped the sign to closed and made herself scarce in the backroom phone, already out to live stream whatever was about to happen to a group text that absolutely included Doreen Foss. "And I need you to know, before I ask it, that I'd be asking it even if I still had nothing but a maintenance salary and a jacket 2 sizes too big. This isn't about anything I can give you. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'm not going to insult you by forgetting it now." Harper's hands trembled around the rag she'd been using to close out the register. "Alexander," he knelt, unhurried, unpolished, entirely himself, and produced a small ring from his coat pocket. Not extravagant, not a headline-worthy stone, simple and warm, and exactly precisely her taste, because he had actually paid attention the whole time to every small thing she loved. "Harper Lane," he said, voice unsteady in a way 19 years of boardrooms had never once made it. "You loved a man who fixed broken latches before you knew his name was on the building. I am asking that same man's whole honest self to spend the rest of his life earning the kind of trust you gave away so freely once before I ever deserved it. Will you marry me?" Harper laughed and cried at the same time, the way you do when your whole heart finally agrees with itself. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Alexander, whoever you are in whatever jacket. Yes." The small crowd that had somehow gathered outside the darkened cafe windows. Priya, Doreen, Walter, half of Harper's old regulars who'd apparently been tipped off by a group text with alarming efficiency, erupted in applause loud enough to rattle the glass. And for a long, perfect moment, Harper Lane forgot entirely that there had ever been a locked elevator, a stolen storage closet binder, a headline calling her a con artist. There was only Alexander's hand in hers, warm and steady, and entirely, finally, unhidden. The final truth arrived 2 weeks later on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, delivered not by Alexander, not by any headline, but by Walter Higgs himself, who shuffled into the kettle during the slow mid-afternoon lull, set down his old toolbox with a familiar clang, and asked almost shyly if Harper had a minute. "Course, Walter. Coffee." "Actually," Walter said, easing himself onto a stool, with the careful deliberation of a man whose knees had earned every bit of that care, "I got something I should have told you a long while back. Kept meaning to. Never seemed like the right moment, what with everything that happened." Harper set down her rag, curious. "Okay, I'm listening." "You remember maybe 8, 9 years back? You'd have been young, still living out near Georgetown. There was a bad ice storm. Whole city shut down for near a week. Pipes freezing everywhere." "I remember," Harper said slowly. "My grandmother's house lost heat for 4 days. I was working a maintenance route out that way then, before I ever came downtown," Walter said. "Old fella, no family car wouldn't start in the ice, no way to get to a shelter. You'd have been, what, 18, 19. You saw me stuck at that gas station on the corner, freezing, and you drove me home yourself in your grandmother's old truck, wouldn't take a dime for the gas, made me a thermos of that pie crust grandmother's soup to take with me." Walter's eyes were bright, unexpectedly emotional. "I never forgot that. Not once in 9 years. Harper's breath caught. I barely remember that. It was just being a decent person, Walter. It was the kind of thing most folks don't do," Walter said gently. "I remembered your name, remembered your face even after all that time. So when the maintenance super downtown mentioned years later they were looking to hire a young manager for the new cafe going into Wolfe Tower, I put your name forward myself. Told them personally I knew a young woman with exactly the kind of heart that place needed behind the counter. Never told you. Didn't seem like something worth mentioning at the time." Harper stood very still, a strange vertiginous feeling opening up beneath her ribs. "Walter, are you telling me you're the reason I got that job? The reason I was even standing behind that counter the morning Alexander walked in?" "I'm telling you, fate's got a funny way of paying back kindness," Walter said with a small, knowing smile.
Didn't have the first idea, mind you, that the fella I'd end up training in electrical work would turn out to be the man himself in disguise, chasing after the exact same woman I'd sent to that lobby years before he ever needed a jacket 2 sizes too big. Never could have planned that. Just seemed looking back on it like maybe some things get set in motion a long time before we notice them moving. Harper sat down slowly across from him, mind reeling backward through every rainy Monday, every locked elevator, every crooked directory sign, every version of this story she thought she'd already finished understanding.
So none of it was really an accident, she said quietly. Not really. Not from the very beginning.
Wasn't an accident you were kind to an old man on an icy road 9 years back either, Walter said. That's the part I want you to hear, Harper. Fate opened one door for you, sure. Small one. Just got you standing behind a counter on the right morning. But everything after that, falling for a man before you knew his name, forgiving him after you learned it. Building this whole place with your own 2 hands, saying yes to him. 2 weeks back wasn't fate that did any of that. That was just you. Choosing it every single day, same as you chose to stop for a stranger on an icy road with nothing to gain from it. Harper thought of Alexander waiting for her every Tuesday and Thursday with nothing but honesty in his hands. She thought of the wildflowers twice given, never demanded. She thought of a rainy Monday morning and a stranger too embarrassed to accept a free cup of coffee, and a year spent learning the hard and honest way that love worth keeping was never the thing that simply happened to you. It was the thing you kept choosing on purpose, one ordinary Tuesday at a time, long after the fairy tale part of the story was already over. Thank you, Walter, she said softly, reaching across the counter to squeeze his weathered hand. For the ride home in the ice storm, and for putting my name forward all those years later without ever asking for a thing in return. Wasn't nothing, Walter said, standing, gathering his toolbox with the same quiet dignity he carried into every room. Just return to kindness is all. Seems to me that's usually how the good stuff starts. He left the way he always did, unhurried, unremarked upon asking for no applause and receiving none, and Harper Lane sat alone for a long moment in the golden afternoon light of the cafe she'd built with her own 2 hands, thinking about doors opened long before we ever noticed them moving, and about the ordinary, extraordinary choice made new every single day to love someone anyway.